Welcome to RBS Together, an on-demand learning series from the National Safe Boating Council. This is an opportunity to bring the recreational boating safety community together to discuss, learn, and debate important issues in our industry. Today, we're joined by Chuck Hawley, a marine industry consultant and lifelong sailor. He will share with us how to keep inflatable life jackets in life-saving condition. Since the introduction of U.S. Coast Guard approved inflatable life jackets over 25 years ago, tens of thousands of boaters have relied on them. In-water performance and freedom of movement make inflatable life jackets a popular choice for anglers, paddlers, and sailors. In this episode, Chuck will share hands-on advice for inflatable life jackets. Chuck, welcome to RBS Together.
Thank you, Yvonne. It's a great opportunity. I appreciate this. And I want to point out to the audience that I'm not usually addressing such a sophisticated audience who's been involved in life-saving and marine safety for such a long time. So some of this may be a little bit of a review because what I've really done is modified a consumer-facing series of slides to adapt to the more professional and more sophisticated audience. So with that caveat, let's get started. As Yvonne said, I call myself a marine industry consultant. Basically, I'm retired after working in the marine industry for about 35 years. And while most of my boating has been sailing, I'm also into a variety of power boats as well, and I enjoy power boating. Recently, I've been the chairman of the Safety at Sea Committee for U.S. Sailing. And in that position, I was responsible for the overall boating safety of offshore sailors by creating training methodologies for them, as well as equipment rules and an online course, for example. So while that is in my past, I'm continuing to be involved in the safety at sea world. So I'd like to start out with a few questions, and this will be very quick, but I want to make sure that we sort of have a context for the rest of the discussion. So my first question is, if somebody handed you the keys to a car that you were not familiar with, what are some of the things that you would do? You know, a number of us we'd adjust the seat position so it's comfortable, or we'll put on our seat belt. We might adjust the mirrors so that we can see, check the gas, maybe ask the owner if it's insured. Maybe it's a stick shift and we're not familiar with driving a stick shift. Well, how about if somebody were to hand you a firearm? I'm not a firearms expert by any means, but it seems to me that you'd want to make sure that they're handing it to you in a safe way. And you'd want to immediately point it away from people and living things. Maybe you put on the safety, or drop the magazine out, or open the cylinder. And in any case, you treat it with the utmost respect. How about if somebody offered you a parachute? Well, this is a little bit more obscure, but when I was in college, I did a lot of glider flying in Southern California. And in many cases, we would wear parachutes. And these were old World War II surplus parachutes in good condition. And one of the things we were taught to do is to open up this flap in the back and make sure the pins that the ripcord was attached to were able to be pulled out. And if the pins were bent, you could pull on the ripcord as much as you wanted, but you couldn't release the parachute. The other thing we were told to do is to always tighten the leg straps, because if you were to deploy a parachute falling at terminal velocity and have loose leg straps, the jerk that happens when the parachute canopy opens up is such that it would give you a lot of bruises in a very sensitive place. So why don't we have a similar procedure when we're given an inflatable life jacket? There's certain questions that you want to be able to answer. Is it ready to inflate? Does it fit? Do I understand how it works? Is it a manually activated life jacket, or is it water activated? Where's the inflation lanyard? Where's the oral inflation tube? These are all topics that we know conceivably if it's our own personal gear. But if somebody is a novice, or if you're borrowing a life jacket from somebody else, we may not have any idea about these questions or these answers. So what are the chances that any given inflatable life jacket won't inflate? Well, I've done a lot of tests, I guess, or demonstrations of life jackets over the last 10 years. U.S. Sailing trains about 1,200 sailors per year in-person courses where we have sailors don foul weather gear and boots and hats and gloves and put on their inflatable life jacket, and they'll jump into a pool, kind of feet first, or fall into the pool, and the life jacket inflates, unless it doesn't. And somewhere between 5% or 10% of these life jackets fail to inflate, or it takes a long time for them to inflate, or they partially inflate, or the person jumps in with what they think is a water-activated life jacket, and they have to pull the ripcord. So the question becomes, what causes these failures, and what can be done? Is it the operator error, not knowing how the life jacket works? Or is it something that due to maintenance, or is there a physical flaw in the life jacket? One of the things that we try to do is to do sort of a failure analysis to figure out what's going on. It's my recollection that the RNLI, Royal National Lifeboat Institute in the UK, looked at all the boat and life jacket inspections that they had done over a period of time and came up with a similar number of failures. Something like 10% of the life jackets would not have inflated. Although I believe in that case, they didn't actually try to inflate them. They surmised that they wouldn't work by inspection. Too often, we put on inflatable life jackets, but we don't have any idea if they're okay. And two recent tragic incidents bring this to light. One of my tasks as the chairman of the Safety at Sea Committee was to investigate boating accidents. And I'm not a professional at this, like many of you are. I am an amateur, but we found out about various sailing incidents where either people had died or it was close to it, and we would investigate to try to find out what the root cause was. There were two recently, one in 2018 and one in 2019, where the individuals fell overboard. One in the top, you can see in the top image, off a Moor 24, very fast, small, light boat, and one off of a Transpac 52, which you can see in the bottom picture. And in both cases, the life jackets failed to inflate, and the sailors drowned. Both life jackets were about 15 years old, which we can determine from looking at similar life jackets. But the problem is that both of these life jackets were lost. One was cremated with the body after it was recovered. And in the other case, the life jacket was disposed of by the Coast Guard and basically went to the dump. So we don't know what the root cause was of these failures. But in each case, the individual who was wearing these life jackets believed it was a functioning life jacket. And we don't also know why they didn't try some other means of inflating it. So what has been the reaction to these deaths? Well, there are a number of sailing forums where people are sort of saying what they believe is the case. And the first one is that there's this high focus on the life jacket failure compared to the other variables that are present. For example, what actions did the crew take? Was other life-saving gear deployed? Did other vessels assist in the rescue of the victim? And what practices were being used to keep the crew member on board in the first place? There's also the discussion of the distrust of life jackets in general. You have quotes like, and these are not actual quotes, I made these up, but like, that's why I'd never wear one, or he would have been alive if he'd worn a Type 1, or they need to inflate, or they inflate when you don't want them to, but not when you need them. And the underlying theme is that there's a reluctance to require that life jackets are worn during races, which of course is a paradox, because we know of many, many, many instances where people have fallen overboard wearing any type of life jacket, and it's been instrumental in their survival. And my point here is that we can't allow any segment of the boating market to suddenly get negative about valuable life-saving gear. it kind of undoes all of the good work that you folks do and that we've been trying to do in the sailing world for many years. So if we had to choose, what would we like inflatable life jacket wearers to know? Well, the first is kind of obvious. It's whether the life jacket is ready to go or not when it's handed to you or when you put it on. The second is how to make a quick determination if the life jacket is manually and water activated. The third is, if those methods don't work, where's the oral inflation tube and how do I use it? The fourth is how to extend your survival time once you're in the water. And the fifth, I'd say, is to understand the need to service your life jacket on regular intervals and the skills to service it. So I know this is really basic, but you have to come back to the understanding of why you wear a life jacket. And I define it as saying that life jackets provide buoyancy and allow you to maintain an airway until you can be rescued after accidental immersion. Virtually all of the people that wear life jackets don't expect to go into the water, possibly unless you're riding a PWC or a small sailboat or something, but it's for accidental immersion. And the greater buoyancy of an inflatable can keep your mouth out of the water in rough conditions and avoid mouth immersions, which of course is the first step towards drowning when you start to aspirate water. And finally, at least in the sailing market, and I would argue in paddling and angling and some other niches of the boating industry, they combine this wonderful freedom of movement when you're on deck with excellent in-water performance. So it's sort of the ultimate life jacket for active boaters. You'll probably recognize Gordon Giesbrecht in this picture. Gordon was in a series of videos that I produced for US Sailing, and we went over numerous pointers for how to increase your survival time in the water. And so this kind of breaks down into 7 different points. First, if the life jacket hasn't inflated due to water activation or pressure activation, pull the ripcord. Pulling the ripcord is an obvious thing to do, but it's really difficult if somebody has taken the jerk to inflate tab and stuffed it up into the shroud of the life jacket where it's inaccessible. If the life jacket still hasn't inflated, expose the oral inflation tube and blow into it. Now it's a little hard to see here, but you'll notice that Gordon is wearing the type of life jacket that has a zipper closure. And it's one thing to have one that's closed with Velcro, because anybody can sort of take their fingers and rip the Velcro open. But in this case, you can't rip a zipper open if you're in the middle of the zipper. It would be like trying to take your jacket off by pulling in the middle of the zipper and trying to tear it apart. So you'll notice over Gordon's left collarbone, there's a little tab, and you have to pull the zipper open at that point, and immediately underneath it is the oral inflation tube. If wearers of life jackets don't realize that that tab exists, they won't be able to get to the oral inflation tube, and they won't be able to have the third of 3 methods in which to inflate the life jacket. The next point is make sure that all PIWs have fully deployed life jackets. By PIW, I'm using the Coast Guard term as person in water, which is nice because it's descriptive and it's gender neutral. A lot of Velcro or even zipper closed shrouds will sort of get a pinch in them where they won't allow the gas to fully expand. And so you'll have this sort of lack of buoyancy plus an asymmetry, plus the life jacket bladder gets very hard. And so you want to make sure that if you're in the water with other people, that you help them fully deploy their life jacket. Next, if you have a strobe light or a LED light or a man overboard beacon, you should turn that on. If you have an ISO spec life jacket or one that comes with a spray hood, you should deploy that, especially in rough conditions. Then it becomes a goal to conserve heat by putting yourself in the heat escape lessening posture, or if you have 3 or more people, to huddle together so that you reduce heat loss. If you're wearing foul weather gear, you'll want to close the wrist and leg closures to keep the circulation of water down. And for sure, you don't want to swim for help. If you have a whistle, and virtually all inflatable life jackets do, you use that to attract attention. Some of you may recall a tragic event on Lake Michigan where a couple of sailors died, their boat inverted, and the rest of the crew crawled up on the upside down boat at night. And they used their whistles to attract other vessels. In the middle of the night, they were in the vicinity, and they were 6 out of the 8 were rescued. Finally, if you are being searched for and somebody is looking at you from a high vantage point, like a helicopter or an aircraft, you can use your arms and legs to splash the water and make yourself a bigger target. So there are a variety of things that we need to teach people to help them extend their survival time. I break the world of inflators for inflatable life jackets into 3 categories. I think a lot of people think of them in 2 categories, but I talk about them in 3. The first, obviously, is the manual inflator. This is the least expensive, and it requires the user to pull on the jerk to inflate tab to get it to inflate. The challenge here is that as you go into cold water and you have this characteristic gasp reflex because you are immersed in cold water and your body's not prepared for it, and you gasp and your head's underwater, suddenly you start to aspirate water and you start to drown very quickly. And some boaters may not actually ever get to the jerk to inflate tab because they're too busy trying to stay on the surface. The second is a water activated inflator. And I call it this rather than an automatic inflator because automatic sort of implies too much. This is something that senses water in its vicinity, and a water sensing element will dissolve or become, it'll reduce its physical properties so that the spring can inflate the cylinder. And of course, all of these have a manual backup. The third is a hydrostatic inflator, which is very common in offshore sailing because it's highly resistant to splashes, and it has to be immersed over 4 inches in the water before it'll inflate. So if you jump in a shallow dive or in a shallow falling in backwards, and it doesn't go 4 inches underwater, it won't inflate until you either immerse yourself or until the lanyard is pulled. So there are 2 basic distinctions when you are doing the daily inspection on inflatable life jackets. The first is to differentiate between whether you have a life jacket that doesn't have cylinder seal indicators or one that does. Now let's explain this. A variety of older and generally less expensive inflators don't have the ability to determine if the CO2 cylinder that's inserted into them has been used before, whether it's been punctured. Modern and more sophisticated inflators have what we call cylinder seal indicators. And this is the ability to determine whether the CO2 cylinder has been pierced and therefore whether it has gas in it or not. And you can see in the case of the inflator with the yellow jerk to inflate tab that there's a green window showing. And that green window shows through a plastic window in the life jacket shroud so that the user, without opening the shroud, can determine if the device is ready to go. Now, this is a manual inflator, but there are also cylinder seal indicator inflators for water activated and hydrostatic inflators. So if you have a device that has a cylinder seal indication, you generally just look for the green indicator through the window. And you can do this as the wearer, your skipper can do this, somebody in the cockpit can do this. But by looking at that green indicator, you are virtually assured that the life jacket is ready to be inflated. If you don't have cylinder seal indication, you need to open up the shroud and to check the CO2 cylinder by unscrewing it and to ensure that the CO2 cylinder hasn't been used previously. You also need to check the water sensing element to make sure that that's intact. So this is quite a bit more complicated, and this is one of the key reasons why, in my experience, when people jump into a pool with a life jacket, which they believe is ready to go, it doesn't work. It's because it's been used previously and somebody's folded it up and put it back into its shroud. In all cases, you want to verify the fit, the condition, the appropriateness of the device. But if you're trying to figure out if it's going to inflate, those are the two key ways to do it. I've created a series of videos on the US Sailing website that are available for free. And I'll just point out that if you look on the US Sailing website, or if you search on Google for inflatable life jacket systems, there are a series of 4 videos, each about 4 or 5 minutes long, that describe this in detail. And they can do a much better job than I can just showing you still images. So I have a couple of questions. If you were out on a pretty day and you saw some powerboat doing endless circles with its engine going at a pretty high rate of speed, what would you think? Or what would you think if you saw a sailboat out on the horizon with the sails luffing and luffing and luffing, and the boat neither falling off onto one tack or the other? Well, these are pretty good indications of trouble. And as a boater, you get more and more sensitive to seeing these indications and realizing that something is messed up. In the case of the circling boat, you might assume that the skipper had fallen overboard and that the boat is now circling him or her. And in the case of the luffing sails, you may believe that it's a single-handed boat where somebody's fallen overboard, or perhaps the people on board just don't know how to sail. So we get sensitive to things that just don't look right. And when it comes to inflatable life jackets, you know, I've got maybe 8 or 10 examples here. There are a lot of reasons that things just don't look right. For example, you can see the window on the life jacket, but you can't see the cylinder seal indication. Or when you open the vest, there are parts that are missing. Like on the Hawley Roberts inflators, it might be missing the little green pin that keeps everything together. Or the CO2 cylinder is highly corroded, and the bladder is starting to chafe because the rust on the CO2 cylinder is so great. So there are a number of indications that even though other things may look okay, you realize, hey, stop, you got to take that thing off and let's inspect this further. So it's not just the green indication, but there may be other indications that something is not quite right. If you're teaching a class on how to rearm and maintain life jackets, one of the challenges is that there are 4 major manufacturers in the world, and each of those manufacturers continues to make their products more sophisticated, and I would argue better, in some cases actually less expensive and still better. And it's not easy to keep track of them. We have inflators from Sweden, Germany, the United Kingdom, the United States, all of which are different. So if you're teaching a boating safety course, or going by your local yacht club or your sailing club, and you're going to teach a class on how to rearm life jackets, you have to be pretty sophisticated in order to know the peculiarities of each of these devices. There was a time I remember going to what we used to call PFDMA meeting, now Life Jacket Association meeting, where there was sort of a push towards having standardized inflators because of this issue. And yet, as you look across at the range of products that are available, it's kind of a good thing because these products are more sophisticated over time and they have some great features. So you'd hate to stop the innovation, but at the same time, it does make me a little bit nervous that if you are going to train people how to use life jackets, you have to be a subject matter expert in a lot of different devices. Many people think that replacing the CO2 cylinder is important if it hasn't been punctured, but if it's simply an older cylinder. Well, certainly, if it looks like this cylinder, you need to replace it. But in general, CO2 cylinders don't need to be replaced until one of these 4 things has happened. 1, it's been pierced in the small end of the cylinder. That's pretty obvious, but if you unscrew it and it's got a hole in it, that's a problem. 2, like the cylinder shown in the picture, it's excessively corroded. 3, if it has some form of cylinder seal indication, For example, a ring that is around the neck of the device that breaks off or it shows red or something. And this is true on both Halkey-Roberts, Secumar, and Hammer inflators. If it has that, that's a good indication it needs to be replaced. Or finally, if it's part of an assembly that has a replacement date, in the case of the Hammer inflators, the entire device gets replaced, even if it hasn't been used every 5 years. So you would be replacing what is essentially a good cylinder with another good cylinder. When is the water sensing element replaced? Well, here are the 4 main manufacturers. And without, this isn't supposed to be about the manufacturers, but it is supposed to show you that there is a diversity of how you decide when to replace them. The general rule is when it's past its date code. But the date code on the yellow bobbin shown in the upper left-hand corner is that it can be kept for 3 years in storage and then 3 years in use. Well, how do you determine this? Well, it has ink jetted on it, a little date of manufacture, not the replacement date, but the date that it was manufactured. And so you can at least know how old it is. But would you say that it's been storage? Would you say that it's been in use? All of that's quite difficult to determine. The good news is that a replacement bobbin is not that expensive. So if you're in doubt, you can get bobbins, replace it, and be good to go for another, conceivably, for another 6 years. The other 3 devices have a replace by date ink jetted onto the product. So the little pill shown in the bottom left has a little ink jet on it, which says that it's the date by which it needs to be replaced. The black cylinder in the lower right, you can actually read it. It says replaced by the 11th month of 2021. And there's a replace by date on the yellow disc inflator in the upper right-hand corner, where it actually says on the front of it, replaced by the year 2021 or 2022. So the manufacturers are doing what they can to warn you that these devices do not last forever. What about periodic or annual inspection? Now, I call it periodic inspection because manufacturers vary in the time between servicing. One of the manufacturers recommends that you service their life jackets every 2 months, where others require it every 6 months, and still others require it every year. Now, frankly, if I had a life jacket that was in my garage in a dry environment waiting for the boating season, and I realized it hadn't been used for a year, there's very little deterioration taking place in that case. But on an annual basis, I'm obligated to do the following steps. And incidentally, you're going to forget when you did this. So there is generally a place inside the life jacket where you can use a Sharpie or some indelible marker and put down the date when the life jacket was inspected. And you can certainly put this information in your vessel's logbook. Remember that cylinders last a long time. It's the water sensing elements that are cheap. And the other aspect is you want to make sure that the gas bladder that provides the buoyancy is such that it hasn't deteriorated. So very quickly, how do we do this? We rip open the shroud, either by unzipping it or undoing the Velcro. Remove the CO2 cylinder. If it's a water activated unit, you remove the water sensing element, whatever that is. We just saw 4 examples. Then you orally until firm. If you orally inflate it, you can develop about 0.5 psi, maybe 3/4 of a psi, and you want to inflate it until the bladder, or the chamber, is full and hard. You don't want to do this with like a bicycle pump or something. It's so that you could possibly burst it, but you do want to get it up until it's tight. Then you leave it alone for several hours. Experts sort of disagree on what the right amount of time is, but longer is better, at least 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 hours, or maybe overnight. When you then come back to the life jacket, if it's soft and spongy, you have a problem. It means it has a leak. Obviously, if it doesn't hold air at all, you've got a big problem. But if it's simply soft and the temperature is roughly the same, then you realize that you've got a small leak. And one of the places to look is the oral inflation tube. Because the oral inflation tube has a valve, in some instances, I've determined that the oral inflation tube valve is leaking, and so the life jacket gets soft. So you can take a little soap film or spit and put it over the end of the oral inflation tube to see if it's leaking, and then you can try to resolve the leak. If the leak is coming through the fabric or at a seam, it's probably time to condemn the life jacket and to cut it up and to get a new one. And if you ever throw away a life jacket because you think that it's got a problem, cut the bladder with a knife so that you don't have the chance of somebody else retrieving it and thinking that it's functional. Then it comes time to put it back together. So you want to verify the date and the condition of the water sensing element. And we've talked about this, where you replace it if necessary, if it's beyond its use-by date. Verify the CO2 cylinder is rust-free and not previously used. And then check all of the accessories on the life jackets, the lights, man overboard, beacons, make sure that their whistle's intact. Then you want to deflate the bladder completely so it has no air inside. Reinstall the water sensing element if you've removed it. Reinstall the CO2 cylinder, and then you refold it according to the manufacturer's instructions. I know this seems like a lot, but you're only doing this every 6 months to a year. And if you do it, you'll have a very high likelihood that that life jacket will serve you well when you fall into the water and you need it. So where can you get more information about this? Well, we start with the manufacturer. And the manufacturers of life jackets really want them to work correctly so that they have good websites, they have downloads and videos and other instructions. There are instructions that come packaged with the product so that it tells you how to rearm it and inspect it. And there are even Tyvek printed instructions inside the product that allow you to look at it, open it up, make sure that it's ready to go. From US Sailing, we've got quite a bit of instructional information. We have online instructional videos that I mentioned before, and this is a screenshot out of one of them. They're not very long, in this case 4 minutes exactly, and I'll take you through how to rearm all of the different life jackets that are on the market. Now, this is one of those things that gets a little dated over time. I don't have some of the most modern inflators, but frankly, the technique hasn't changed that much. You can also elect to take a safety at sea course through US Sailing, either online or in person, and this information is repeated. And finally, we've printed a safety at sea handbook, which has good information, but frankly, the videos do a better job of describing this. So, in conclusion, inflatable life jacket users have to know more about how they work so that they can maintain them in A+ condition. They need to know the methods of inflation, the specifics about their device, how to rearm it and maintain it. Skippers and wearers need to make sure the life jacket is good to go when it's put on, because you can't simply presume that it's going to work. Everyone needs to look for signs of telltale failures. For example, the fact that you can't see the green indicator through the window, but you realize it's probably okay. That doesn't cut. That doesn't work. So this is and life jackets need to be maintained as recommended by the manufacturer. This is a great opportunity for the boating safety world to train others in how life jackets work and how they're maintained. A course like this takes about an hour. Have everybody come into a communal room, bring their inflatable life jackets, tear them open. It's great to have some spare parts on hand so that you can help people that maybe have out-of-date products, or have them bring a rearming kit from the manufacturer with them and replace the parts that need to be replaced and fold them back up, and you will have increased the overall safety of that group by quite a bit. When we do this, we almost always find something that was wrong in one of the life jackets or more that would have prevented it from working like the wearer anticipated that it would work. This is serious business, and it's a great opportunity to improve boating safety. Hey, it's been my pleasure to address you today. Thank you very much for your attention, and now I'll kick it back to Yvonne.
Thank you so much, Chuck. Goodness, this was really informative for me. I personally had not, to be very frank and honest, I've never checked the water sensor on my inflatable life jacket. I've only focused on the cylinder. So that is one area where I need to take a look at that. I'm not sure, when that was last looked at, and make sure that is really up to speed on where it needs to be the next time I wear it. I did receive a few questions for you, and one is one that I often hear too is boaters are concerned, if they have the correct replacement cylinder, where do they find it? How do they know if they're getting the right one?
That is a great question. And it's one that I dealt with for a long time when I was working on the West Marine catalogs and the West Marine website. It is not an easy question to answer. First of all, every life jacket manufacturer that makes inflatables has identified specific rearming kits that meet two different criteria. One is the nature of the inflator that's used, and the second is the size or the capacity of the inflatable bladder. Life jackets vary from about requiring 16 grams of CO2 all the way up to 60 grams of CO2. So if you have the wrong cylinder, it's a problem. You can under or overinflate the life jacket. So the easiest way would be to look in the manufacturer's instructions and to buy a manufacturer's rearming kit. However, when you do this as a retailer, you end up with a bazillion different kits going back, West Marine sold life jackets going back to the mid-90s, inflatable life jackets going back to the mid-90s. So you have this legacy of 25 years of life jackets. And, some of those manufacturers probably aren't even in business anymore. So we took a slightly different approach, and the industry has moved in this direction to have a single manufacturer who sort of acts as the consolidator by putting the parts into a kit so that a single kit can service different life jackets that meet the same requirement. In other words, let's say that you have a bunch of different life jackets that all use a particular Halkey-Roberts inflator and all require 33-gram cylinders. At some point, there's no reason not to put those parts into a single container and to sell them to owners of different life jackets. So you'll find on websites around the country that they will tell you which one to use, but it may not be the manufacturer's rearming kit. It may be one that, in a sense, is guaranteed to have the same parts inside of it. This is also a good opportunity to use the internet and to use your local retailer to have them help you find the correct rearming kit. So that's a really, really good question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Chuck. Another question, and this is from the law enforcement side. They've seen inflatable life jackets worn incorrectly in many different ways. Sometimes, underclothes, maybe they're, if it's a belt pack, maybe it's worn backwards. Just tips for our law enforcement officers as they're seeing boaters out there, maybe even volunteers, on how they can educate boaters to wear an inflatable life jacket correctly, and maybe start that conversation about how to maintain a life jacket as well.
Yeah, that too is a really good question. The law enforcement, marine law enforcement professionals have a challenge because an awful lot of well-meaning boaters who are not trying to skirt the rules will use life jackets in general incorrectly. So one of the key things is that inflatable life jackets, at least at the date of which I'm doing this presentation, are for those who are 16 years and older, swimmers, and people that weigh over 80 pounds. So I have a number of daughters who have grown up in the boating world, and even though it may have been a good device to wear when they were under 16 years old, it doesn't count in the inventory if they're wearing the life jacket. And if they're 12 and under, it is essentially illegal to wear them. So this is an area where you want to make sure that you wear the life jacket according to the label requirements that are on the inside of the life jacket, or on the device. The second thing is it's really convenient to move that belt pack life jacket around to the small of your back and to kind of keep it out of the way so it's not in your lap. And it's a really bad idea to do this. We see this all the time with people that are paddling SUPs, stand-up paddle boards, because it's more convenient if it's in the back. But realize that when you fall overboard and you're wearing a manually activated belt pack, to pull it around in front of you so that you can get to it, then to pull the ripcord, and then to do the secondary donning of taking this inflated bladder and pull it over your head. If you are nervous about drowning, or if you fall into cold water, that can be a very difficult thing to do. So keeping a belt pack life jacket in your front area is the right thing to do. And the final thing that you point out is some people will start out maybe in the afternoon, they put on a life jacket, it feels good, and then it gets a little cold as they come back into the harbor, so they throw on a jacket over it, and this does a number of things. One is it may preclude you from getting to the ripcord. Two is when the life jacket inflates, now it puts all of this pressure on your chest and may make it difficult to breathe because the jacket, the external jacket, doesn't expand enough. So a life jacket needs to be on the outside of your clothing. And this is especially true with foul weather gear, where somebody may think that having the life jacket on the inside of the foul weather gear will protect it. Well, that's not true. It needs to be on the outside. So again, really good question. And this may be a great opportunity for law enforcement officers to say, hey, when's the last time you took a look inside that life jacket to make sure it was ready to go? When I'm in front of an audience, I know that if there are 30 or 40 people in that room, if they all pull the lanyard at that point, one or two of them is likely not to inflate. And that is a really striking lesson, because people understand that it could have been them and they could have been left without buoyancy.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point to make. And back to at the very beginning, you mentioned when the folks would jump into the pool to test their inflatable life jacket and to see how it reacts when it's in the water. I've often heard from boaters, they annually check their inflatable life jacket, they know how to repack it, but they have never experienced it actually inflating while they're in the water. So do you have any tips for boaters to test the life jacket in the water so they know what to expect?
Yeah. And your point is really well taken. Even people that maintain their life jackets on a regular basis haven't had that experience. And frankly, it can be a little frightening, or a little, perhaps a better word is disorienting, for a couple of reasons. One is that it sort of makes a popping sound. And unless, if you're on the surface, it kind of, I remember there used to be this great series of pictures showing a woman inflating a life jacket at a boat show, and you can see her hair flying up in the air as this thing opens up. Well, it's not like an airbag going off, but essentially it's a water-based airbag. The other thing is that the life jackets have to have enough pressure in them to inflate at cold temperatures. And as a result, if you're in warmer temperatures, they can get uncomfortably tight around your neck. Now, if you've gone to a safety at sea course, or if you've gone to a Coast Guard auxiliary or power squadron course, they will generally tell you to take your index finger and to push down on the oral inflation tube valve to let out a little gas. And of course, when you release your finger, it'll stop, and you soften up the chamber so that it's not pressing on your neck, because frankly, it feels a little bit like you're being choked. That tightness is important to keep the inflation chamber in place on your body, but if it does feel like it's too tight, just a little release of gas, just a couple of seconds, will give you plenty of buoyancy, but make it much more comfortable. The other thing about an inflatable life jacket is that because it has more buoyancy than traditional life jackets, in most cases, you tend to float sort of on your back, and it becomes difficult to swim. So there's some other techniques that you should practice. If you need to swim, it may be better to swim on your back using the backstroke than to try to do the Australian crawl and go on your stomach and put your face closer to the water. So again, a really good question, because if you haven't tried it, you wouldn't know these things, and it can be disorienting.
Well, Chuck, thank you so much for this great advice on inflatable life jackets. I know I personally have learned quite a bit from this, and I need to go out to my garage and get my inflatable life jacket out of storage and check out that water sensor, because now I'm curious. So that's one area I have never inspected on my inflatable life jacket. If anyone else watching has additional questions, please feel free to email those to outreach@safeboatingcouncil.org, and we'll make sure to get the questions to Chuck. And we just really appreciate your time watching today. And Chuck, again, thank you so much for this great information. We're so grateful to have you as an expert and to share this insight on inflatable life jackets.
Well, so it's my pleasure. And I would hate for something as valuable as inflatable life jackets to be misunderstood. So I think it is all our responsibility to get the word out. And thanks to all of you who do such a great job making boating safer for all of us.
Thank you, Chuck. So on behalf of the National Safe Boating Council, thank you for watching RBS Together.